This is the heartbreaking true story of Margaret, a woman who sacrificed everything for her son, only to be called worthless baggage at his wedding. But what happened next will leave you speechless. Get comfortable, because this narrative promises to grip you from beginning to end. What you're about to hear is a raw, unfiltered account of a mother's love, betrayal, and the moment she decided enough was enough. Hi there, sweetheart. Come sit here close to me. Make yourself comfortable. I hope you have a little time to listen to this old woman of 78 years. You know, I have so many things stored up in here. A mountain of stories to tell. Sometimes it hurts to remember, but I need to get it out. What a relief to have you here to listen to me. These were years that made me who I am today. They broke me and put me back together again. There were dark days, endless nights. Prepare yourself, honey. This isn't an easy story to hear. My name is Margaret, and I want to tell you about the day my own son looked me in the eye at his wedding and called me worthless baggage in front of 200 guests. But more importantly, I want to tell you about what I did next, something that changed our relationship forever and taught him the true meanings of worth. You see, for 29 years, I gave that boy everything I had. I worked 3 jobs to put him through college, sold my wedding ring to buy his first car, and went without meals so he could have designer clothes. I thought I was raising a grateful, loving son. I was wrong. But this story isn't just about betrayal. It's about redemption, about finding your strength when everyone else sees you as weak, and about the moment a mother decides she's done being taken for granted. Because what happened after that wedding, well, it's something that still gives me chills to this day. When I walked out of that reception hall, I wasn't the same broken woman who had walked in. I had a plan, and honey, it was going to teach my son a lesson he'd never forget. Some of you might think what I did was too harsh. Others might say he had it coming. But I promise you this. By the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes love means letting someone fall, so they can learn to stand on their own. You'll see how a mother's heart can break and heal at the same time, and how the greatest gift we can give our children isn't always the one they want, but the one they need. So buckle up, because this journey we're about to take together will make you laugh, cry, and maybe even reconsider everything you thought you knew about family, sacrifice, and the true price of unconditional love. This is my story, and I'm finally ready to tell it all. If you've ever felt undervalued, overlooked, or taken for granted by the people you love most, this story is for you. And when you hear what happens next, I want you to leave a comment and tell me, would you have done the same thing? Because the support and wisdom from people like you is what gives me the strength to share these painful memories. Your stories, your encouragement, they matter more than you know. I was born in 1946 in a small farming town in Iowa, the youngest of 5 children. My father, Robert, was a corn farmer who believed children should be seen and not heard. My mother, Dorothy, was a gentle soul who spent her days canning vegetables and mending clothes, always with a sad smile that never quite reached her eyes. We lived in a modest farmhouse that creaked in the winter wind, and every morning started with chores before the sun came up. Life on the farm was hard, especially for us kids. My older brothers, Thomas, William, and Samuel, were expected to help with the heavy work, while my sister Helen and I took care of the house and the chickens. Daddy didn't believe in coddling anyone, especially not his daughters. Women need to learn their place early, he'd say, his voice stern and unforgiving. A soft woman makes for a hard life. I remember being 8 years old and watching my mother cry quietly while she washed dishes, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. When I asked her what was wrong, she'd just pull me close and whisper, "Nothing, sweetheart. Mama's just tired." But even as a child, I knew it was more than tiredness. It was a deep, bone-weary sadness that came from years of having her dreams slowly crushed under the weight of duty and expectations. School was my escape. I loved reading, and my teacher, Mrs. Peterson, always said I had a bright mind. But Daddy didn't see much point in educating girls beyond the basics. "Margaret doesn't need fancy book learning," he'd tell anyone who'd listen. "She needs to learn how to keep a house and raise babies. That's what women are for." Those words cut deep. Even though I heard them so often, they became like background noise. When I turned 16, everything changed. There was a new family in town, the Hendersons, and they had a son named James, who was 21 and fresh out of the army. He was tall, with dark hair, and the kind of smile that made my stomach flutter. James worked at the grain elevator and had plans to eventually take over his father's small construction business. More importantly, he treated me like I mattered, like my thoughts and dreams were worth hearing. James would wait for me after school, leaning against his old Chevrolet truck with that crooked grin of his. We'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. Books I'd read, places we wanted to see, the life we might build together. He was the first person who ever made me feel special, like I was more than just another pair of hands to help with the work. Of course, Daddy didn't approve of James at first. "That boy's got no land, no real prospects," he'd grumble over dinner. "Margaret's too young to be thinking about boys anyway." But James was persistent and respectful, always calling Daddy Sir and offering to help with whatever needed doing around the farm. Slowly, Daddy warmed up to him, especially when James started talking about wanting to settle down and start a family soon. The courtship was sweet but brief. James proposed on my 17th birthday, offering me a simple ring he'd saved up for months to buy. "Margaret," he said down on one knee in the cornfield behind our house, "you're the most beautiful, intelligent woman I've ever met. Will you marry me and make me the luckiest man alive?" I said yes without hesitation, my heart so full of love and hope I thought it might burst. We married in the spring of 1964, when I had just turned 18. It was a small ceremony in the Baptist church where my family had worshipped for generations. I wore my grandmother's dress, altered to fit my smaller frame, and carried wildflowers that James had picked for me that morning. Looking back, I was so young, so naive about what marriage really meant. I thought love would be enough to overcome anything. The first year was magical. We rented a tiny house on the edge of town, and I threw myself into being the perfect wife. I cooked elaborate meals, kept the house spotless, and waited eagerly for James to come home each evening. We'd sit on the porch swing he'd built, talking about our future, about the children we'd have and the life we'd build together. James was tender and patient with me, teaching me about intimacy with a gentleness that made me fall even deeper in love with him. In early 1965, I discovered I was pregnant. James was over the moon, already talking about whether it would be a boy or a girl, what we'd name the baby, how he'd teach our child to fish and hunt. I was excited too, but also terrified. At 19, I felt too young to be responsible for another human being. My mother tried to prepare me, sharing what wisdom she could about childbirth and motherhood, but nothing could have prepared me for what was to come. Daniel James Henderson was born on October 15th, 1965, after 18 hours of labor that nearly broke me. But the moment I held that tiny, perfect baby in my arms, I knew my life had changed forever. He was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, with James's dark hair and the brightest blue eyes. I promised him right then and there that I would do everything in my power to give him the best life possible. James was a devoted father from the start. He'd spend hours just watching Daniel sleep, marveling at his tiny fingers and toes. "Look at him, Margaret," he'd whisper. "He's going to do great things. We're going to make sure he has every opportunity we never had." Those words became our mission statement, our guiding principle for everything that followed. But raising a child was expensive, especially on James's construction worker salary. The little house that had seemed cozy for two felt cramped with a baby and all his necessities. James started working longer hours, taking on weekend jobs, anything to bring in extra money. I wanted to help, but with Daniel needing constant care and no family nearby to babysit, my options were limited. That's when I started taking in sewing and laundry from other families in town. I'd work late into the night after Daniel was asleep, my fingers raw from needle pricks, my eyes strained from working by lamplight. Every penny I earned went into our savings jar, money we were setting aside for Daniel's future. "Our boy is going to college," James would say firmly. "He's not going to be stuck in a dead-end job like his old man." When Daniel was 2, James got the opportunity to expand his father's business, but it required taking out a substantial loan. We mortgaged everything we had, including the little house we'd grown to love. It was a huge risk, but James was confident it would pay off. "This is our chance, Margaret," he explained, his eyes bright with ambition. "If this works, we can give Daniel everything he deserves." For a while it seemed like the gamble would pay off. The construction business grew, and James hired 2 additional workers. We were able to move into a larger house across town, with a proper yard for Daniel to play in, and even a guest room for when family visited. I felt like we were finally building the life we'd dreamed of. But then the economy took a downturn in 1969, and construction jobs became scarce. James had to lay off his workers, and soon we were struggling to make the loan payments. The stress began to take its toll on our marriage. James would come home exhausted and frustrated, snapping at me over little things that never would have bothered him before. I tried to be understanding, but I was stressed too, taking care of a 4-year-old while worrying constantly about our finances. It was during this difficult time that I made a decision that would change everything. I got a job at the local diner, working the early morning shift so I could be home when Daniel got back from preschool. The work was hard, being on my feet for 6 hours, dealing with demanding customers, cleaning up messes, but the tips helped us keep our heads above water. Daniel didn't understand why Mama had to go to work so early. He'd cry when I left at 5 a.m., clinging to James and asking when I'd be home. It broke my heart every single day, but I knew I was doing it for him, for our family's future. Every dollar I earned at that diner was another step closer to the college fund we were building for our son. James tried to hide his feelings, but I could see the shame in his eyes every time I left for work. In his mind, a man should be able to provide for his family without his wife having to work outside the home. "This is temporary," he'd promise me. "Once things pick up again, you can quit and stay home where you belong." But deep down, I think we both knew that life as we'd known it was over. The strain of financial pressure and my work schedule put cracks in our marriage that grew wider with each passing month. James started drinking more. Just a beer or 2 at first, but gradually it became a nightly ritual. He'd sit in his chair after dinner, silent and distant, while I cleaned up and helped Daniel with his letters and numbers. The easy conversations we used to have disappeared, replaced by tense exchanges about bills and responsibilities. One night in 1971, when Daniel was almost 6, James came home later than usual, smelling like alcohol and another woman's perfume. I confronted him in our bedroom, my voice shaking with hurt and anger. "How could you do this to us, James? How could you do this to Daniel?" He looked at me with eyes I didn't recognize, cold and defensive. "Maybe if you were home more, instead of always working, I wouldn't have to look elsewhere for company." The words hit me like a physical blow. Here I was, working myself to exhaustion to help support our family, and he was making it sound like it was my fault he'd strayed. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how we'd gotten so far from the young couple who'd been so deeply in love just 7 years earlier. Things limped along for another year, both of us trying to pretend everything was fine for Daniel's sake. But the trust was broken, and we couldn't find our way back to each other. James's drinking got worse, and the other women became a regular occurrence. I stopped confronting him about it, focusing all my energy on Daniel and trying to provide some stability in his increasingly chaotic world. The end came in the spring of 1972. James announced that he was leaving, that he'd fallen in love with a woman named Carol, who worked at the bank in the next town over. "I'm not happy, Margaret," he said, not even able to look me in the eye. I haven't been happy for a long time. Carol makes me feel alive again." He packed a suitcase that very night and drove away, leaving me and 6-year-old Daniel to figure out how to survive on our own. I'll never forget having to explain to Daniel why Daddy wasn't coming home anymore. He was so young, too young to understand concepts like divorce and broken promises. "Did I do something wrong, Mama?" he asked, his little face scrunched up with confusion and worry. "Is that why Daddy left?" I held him close and assured him that none of this was his fault, that sometimes grown-ups just couldn't live together anymore, but that both Mama and Daddy loved him very much. But inside, I was falling apart. At 26, I was a single mother with no college education, no family support system nearby, and a diner job that barely covered our basic expenses. The house payments were impossible to manage on my salary alone, so we had to move into a small apartment on the wrong side of town. Daniel had to change schools, leaving behind the friends he'd made and the teachers who knew him. James sent child support sporadically at first, but as time went on, the payments became less frequent and eventually stopped altogether. When I tried to reach him, I discovered he'd moved to another state with Carol, leaving no forwarding address. I felt abandoned and betrayed, but more than that, I felt angry. How dare he walk away from his responsibilities? How dare he abandon the child he'd once claimed to love more than life itself? That anger became my fuel. I picked up extra shifts at the diner, working doubles whenever I could find childcare for Daniel. Mrs. Rodriguez, our elderly neighbor, took pity on us and offered to watch him for a few dollars a day, which was all I could afford. Daniel would spend hours at her house after school, doing homework at her kitchen table while she cooked dinner and told him stories about her native Mexico. By the time Daniel turned 8, I'd managed to save enough money to move us into a slightly better apartment, one with 2 bedrooms so he didn't have to sleep on the living room couch anymore. I furnished it entirely with second-hand pieces from garage sales and thrift stores, but I made sure everything was clean and as nice as I could make it. Daniel deserved better, and I was determined to give it to him somehow. I also made a decision that would shape the rest of our lives. I was going to make sure Daniel never wanted for anything important, no matter what I had to sacrifice. If he needed new school clothes, I'd work extra hours to pay for them. If he wanted to join Little League, I'd find a way to cover the fees and equipment costs. If he showed interest in music lessons or art classes, I'd make it happen somehow. Looking back, I think I was trying to overcompensate for his father's absence, trying to be both mother and father to a boy who needed more than one person could possibly provide. But at the time, all I knew was that I loved my son more than my own life, and I was willing to do whatever it took to ensure he had every opportunity to succeed. The years blurred together in a constant cycle of work, worry, and trying to be enough for Daniel. I watched other mothers at school events, women who had husbands and help and financial security, and I felt so inadequate by comparison. But Daniel seemed to be thriving despite our circumstances. He was smart, getting good grades, and the teachers always had positive things to say about his behavior and potential. When Daniel was 10, something wonderful happened that gave me hope for our future. I met Robert Miller at the diner where I worked. He was a traveling salesman who stopped in regularly during his routes through town, always ordering the same thing: coffee, black, and a slice of apple pie. He was quiet and polite, different from the other men who tried to flirt with the waitresses. There was something steady and reliable about him that drew me in. Robert was 42, a widower whose wife had died of cancer 3 years earlier. He had no children of his own, having devoted himself to caring for his sick wife during their marriage. When he learned about my situation, he didn't run away like most men would have. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in getting to know both me and Daniel. The courtship was slow and careful. Robert would time his routes to spend more time in our town, taking Daniel and me to dinner at the local family restaurant or to the movies on Saturday afternoons. He never tried to replace Daniel's father or discipline him. Instead, he became a friend and mentor, teaching him how to throw a baseball properly and helping him with math homework. When I couldn't figure out the new methods they were teaching in school, Daniel was suspicious at first, protective of our little family unit, and wary of anyone who might upset the careful balance we'd created. But Robert's patience and genuine kindness gradually won him over. When Robert proposed to me in 1978, when Daniel was 13, my son actually encouraged me to say yes. "He makes you happy, Mom," Daniel said with a maturity beyond his years. "And he's good to us. I think Dad would want you to be happy." Robert and I married in a simple ceremony at the courthouse, with Daniel as our only witness. We moved into Robert's house across town, a modest but well-maintained place with a proper yard and a basement, where Daniel could have his own space to play and study. For the first time in years, I felt like we were a real family again. Robert formally adopted Daniel when he turned 14, giving him the Miller name and all the legal protections that came with it. "This boy is my son now," Robert declared proudly. "I want him to have every advantage, every opportunity to make something of himself." True to his word, Robert began setting aside money for Daniel's college fund, adding to the small amount I'd managed to save over the years. High school was when Daniel really began to shine. He was popular with his classmates, played on the basketball team, and maintained excellent grades in challenging courses. Robert never missed a game or a school event, cheering louder than any biological father ever could have. He helped Daniel with college applications, drove him to campus visits, and beamed with pride when acceptance letters started arriving. I was so proud of the young man Daniel was becoming. He was respectful, hard-working, and seemed to have a bright future ahead of him. The scholarships he earned, combined with the college fund we'd built, meant he could attend the state university without accumulating crushing debt. Robert and I felt like all our sacrifices had been worth it. But somewhere during Daniel's college years, things began to change. He started coming home less frequently, and when he did visit, he seemed different, more distant, more critical of our modest lifestyle. He'd make comments about our furniture, our neighborhood, the cars we drove. "You guys could do better," he'd say, with a tone that made me feel small. "You're settling for less than you deserve." I tried to dismiss these changes as normal college behavior, the natural result of a young man being exposed to new ideas and different ways of living. Robert was more concerned. "That boy is getting too big for his britches," he'd mutter. After Daniel left following a particularly tense visit, someone needs to remind him where he came from and who got him where he is. After Daniel graduated with a degree in business administration, he landed a job with a marketing firm in Chicago. The salary was impressive, more money than Robert and I had ever dreamed of making. Daniel moved into a downtown apartment, bought expensive clothes, and started dating women whose names appeared in the society pages of the newspaper. Our phone conversations became less frequent and more superficial. When I'd ask about his life, his work, his relationships, Daniel would give short answers and change the subject. It was like talking to a polite stranger rather than the son I'd raised. Robert noticed too. "He's ashamed of us," he said one evening after a particularly awkward phone call. Success has gone to his head. Still, I made excuses for Daniel's behavior. He was busy building his career, finding his place in the world. This was what we'd wanted for him, to have opportunities we'd never had, to move beyond the limitations of our small-town life. If that meant growing apart from us, well, that was the price of success, wasn't it? The truth hit me like a freight train during Daniel's visit home for Robert's 60th birthday. In 1995, Daniel arrived driving a brand new BMW, wearing a suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. Throughout the party, I watched him interact with our friends and neighbors, people who'd known him since he was a child, people who'd supported and encouraged him through the years. He was polite but condescending, speaking to them like they were children who couldn't possibly understand his sophisticated big city life. When Mrs. Rodriguez, our old neighbor who'd cared for him so many afternoons, tried to tell him how proud she was of his success, Daniel barely acknowledged her. his attention focused on his expensive watch, as if he had somewhere more important to be. That night, after everyone had gone home, I confronted him. "Daniel, what's happened to you? These people love you. They've watched you grow up, and you're treating them like they're beneath you." His response chilled me to the bone. "Mom, you need to understand that I've moved beyond this place. These people, I can't pretend to relate to their small-town problems anymore. I have responsibilities, a reputation to maintain." "What about your responsibility to the people who helped you get where you are?" I asked, my voice shaking with hurt and anger. Daniel shrugged, seemingly unmoved by my emotion. "I'm grateful for what you and Robert did, but that's in the past. I can't live my life looking backward. That was the beginning of the end for us, though I didn't realize it at the time." Over the next few years, Daniel's visits became even more infrequent. He'd call on birthdays and holidays, but the conversations were strained and brief. When Robert was diagnosed with heart disease in 1998, Daniel expressed appropriate concern, but didn't offer to help with medical expenses or caregiving responsibilities. Robert fought his illness with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout his life, but the medical bills were overwhelming even with insurance. I picked up extra shifts at the diner, now working as a manager but still barely making ends meet. When I finally swallowed my pride and asked Daniel for help, his response broke my heart. "Mom, I can't be responsible for every family financial crisis. You and Robert need to figure this out on your own. Robert died in 2001, leaving me widowed at 55 and facing a mountain of debt." Daniel came to the funeral, looking appropriately somber in his expensive black suit, but he left immediately after the service without offering any support or comfort. I felt more alone than I had since James abandoned us all those years ago. The years that followed were the hardest of my life. I sold the house Robert and I had shared, moving into a small apartment near the diner where I continued to work. My health began to suffer from decades of stress and physical labor, but I couldn't afford to slow down. Daniel knew about my struggles. I'd mentioned them during our rare phone conversations, but he never offered help beyond vague suggestions that I should downsize or consider retirement. Then, in 2018, Daniel called with news that should have filled me with joy. He was getting married. Her name was Victoria, and she came from one of Chicago's prominent families. The wedding would be elaborate, he explained. A black tie affair at an exclusive country club with 200 guests. "It's going to be quite an event, Mom. Victoria's family has connections throughout the city." I was 72 years old, working part-time at the diner to supplement my meager Social Security checks, and living in a run-down apartment that barely passed for habitable. But my son was getting married, and nothing was going to keep me from being there for him. I spent months saving for a dress, shoes, and a gift worthy of such an occasion. I had my hair done at the nicest salon in town and practiced walking in heels I hadn't worn in years. The wedding was indeed spectacular. The country club was decorated with thousands of white roses and crystal chandeliers that sparkled like stars. Victoria looked like a princess in her designer gown, and Daniel was handsome in his custom tuxedo. I felt proud watching my son, remembering the little boy who'd clung to my hand on his first day of school, the teenager who'd worked so hard to earn his scholarships. But as the evening progressed, I began to notice how Daniel introduced me to his new in-laws and colleagues. "This is my mother, Margaret," he'd say, then quickly change the subject or move away. There was no mention of how I'd raised him alone, how I'd worked multiple jobs to support his dreams, how Robert and I had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities. The moment that shattered my heart came during the reception, when Daniel stood up to make his speech thanking everyone who'd helped him reach this milestone in his life. He thanked Victoria's parents for welcoming him into their family. He thanked his business partners for their support. He thanked his college professors and mentors. But when it came to acknowledging me, the woman who'd given up everything for him, his words cut deeper than any physical wound ever could. "And finally," Daniel said, raising his champagne glass, I want to thank my mother for being here tonight. I know it wasn't easy for her to make the trip." He paused and I held my breath, waiting for him to acknowledge everything I'd done for him. Instead, he continued with words that felt like a knife to my heart. "Mom, I know you've always been, well, let's call it extra baggage in my life, but tonight I'm grateful that even worthless baggage can sometimes serve a purpose." The room erupted in polite laughter, but I felt like I was drowning. Worthless baggage. Those words echoed in my mind as I sat there, forced to smile while my son's friends and colleagues chuckled at what they thought was a harmless joke. Victoria's mother leaned over and patted my hand sympathetically, which somehow made it worse. I made it through the rest of the reception on autopilot, accepting congratulations from people who had no idea what I was feeling inside. When Daniel and Victoria left for their honeymoon, he hugged me briefly and said, "Thanks for coming, Mom. Try not to cause any drama while we're gone." Even his farewell was a dismissal, a reminder of my place in his new, sophisticated life. I drove back to my little apartment that night in a daze, still wearing my carefully chosen dress, still processing what had just happened. For 3 days, I couldn't get out of bed. I called in sick to the diner and lay there, replaying that moment over and over, trying to understand how the son I'd loved and sacrificed for could humiliate me so publicly, so cruelly. But by the 4th day, something had changed inside me. The hurt was still there, but it was accompanied by something else, a cold, determined anger that I'd never felt before. I realized that I'd spent 30 years making excuses for Daniel's behavior, convincing myself that his selfishness was just a phase, that deep down he was still the loving boy I'd raised. But that speech had stripped away all my illusions. My son had become a man who saw his own mother as worthless baggage. Well, if that's how he saw me, then it was time to show him what real baggage looked like. You see, honey, there were things about our family's financial situation that Daniel didn't know, things I'd never told him, because I wanted him to succeed on his own merits. When Robert died, he'd left me more than just debt. There was also a life insurance policy and some investments he'd made over the years. Modest, but substantial enough to secure my future if I was careful. I'd been living like a pauper, working at the diner not because I had to, but because it gave me purpose and connection to people. More importantly, Robert had been smart about money in ways Daniel never knew. Over the years, he'd quietly purchased several rental properties in areas that were beginning to gentrify. By 2018, those properties were worth a small fortune. I owned 4 apartment buildings and 2 commercial spaces in what had become trendy neighborhoods. The rental income alone was enough to live comfortably, but I'd continued working and living modestly because I'd planned to leave everything to Daniel. After that wedding speech, I realized I needed to reconsider my legacy plans. The first thing I did was hire a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but one of the best estate planning attorneys in the state. I drove to the city, walked into his downtown office wearing my best clothes, and explained exactly what I wanted to do. He listened carefully, occasionally raising an eyebrow but never judging my decisions. "Mrs. Miller," he said when I finished explaining my plan, "are you absolutely certain about this? These are irreversible decisions that will significantly impact your son's inheritance." I looked him straight in the eye and said, "My son called me worthless baggage at his wedding. I think it's time he learned what it feels like to carry some real weight." Over the next 6 months, I restructured everything. The rental properties were placed in a trust that would benefit several charities, focused on helping single mothers and their children. My savings and investments were similarly redirected. I kept enough to ensure my own comfort for the rest of my life. But Daniel's inheritance went from substantial to practically nothing. But that wasn't the end of my plan. Oh no, honey, I was just getting started. You see, Daniel had always been secretive about his finances, but I knew enough about his lifestyle to suspect he was living beyond his means. The expensive apartment, the luxury cars, the designer clothes, the exclusive club memberships. All of it suggested someone who was spending heavily to maintain an image. I hired a private investigator to look into his financial situation, and what we discovered was both shocking and satisfying. Daniel was drowning in debt. Credit cards maxed out, personal loans from multiple sources, even money borrowed against his 401k. His marriage to Victoria hadn't been just about love. It had been about financial survival. He'd been counting on her family's wealth to bail him out of his financial troubles. But Victoria's parents weren't as generous as he'd hoped, and the newlyweds were struggling to maintain their lavish lifestyle on their combined salaries. That's when I made my move. I started quietly buying up Daniel's debts. When credit card companies were ready to write off his accounts as bad debt, I purchased them for pennies on the dollar. When his personal loans came due, and he couldn't pay, I bought those too. Within a year, I owned nearly every cent of my son's debt, over $800,000 worth. The beauty of my plan was that Daniel had no idea what was happening. The debt collectors who contacted him were legitimate companies I'd hired to manage the accounts. From his perspective, his financial problems were just getting worse as creditors became more aggressive about collecting what he owed. Then came the foreclosure notice on his expensive downtown condo. Daniel had been leveraging the property's equity to fund his lifestyle, but when the market shifted and his income couldn't cover the payments, the bank moved to take possession. He called me for the first time in months, his voice panicked and desperate. "Mom, I'm in trouble," he said, and for a moment I heard echoes of the little boy he used to be. "I might lose the condo. I know we haven't been close lately, but I was hoping. Could you possibly help me out? Maybe co-sign for a loan or something?" I let him talk, listening to him explain his financial situation in terms that made it sound like temporary, bad luck, rather than the result of his own poor choices and arrogance. When he finished his pitch, I was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Daniel," I said slowly, "didn't you tell everyone at your wedding that I was worthless baggage? I'm not sure how worthless baggage could possibly help someone in your position." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "Mom, that was just... I was nervous. It came out wrong. You know I didn't mean it like that." But we both knew he had meant it exactly like that. "Please, I'm desperate here. Victoria's parents won't help, and I don't have anywhere else to turn." "I'm sorry, Daniel," I said, and I genuinely was sorry. Sorry that it had come to this. Sorry that my son had become someone I barely recognized. "But I can't help you. You'll have to figure this out on your own, just like I did when your father abandoned us, just like I did when Robert died and left me with medical bills." He tried arguing, pleading, even getting angry, but I held firm. When he finally hung up, I sat in my comfortable chair in my modest apartment and cried, not for him, but for the mother I used to be, the woman who would have bankrupted herself to save her son from any hardship. The foreclosure proceeded, and Daniel and Victoria had to move into a much smaller apartment in a less fashionable neighborhood. Victoria's family was reportedly concerned about Daniel's financial instability, and rumors circulated that their marriage was under strain. Daniel took a second job working weekends at a home improvement store, the kind of manual labor he'd once looked down on. But I still wasn't finished. You see, honey, I'd learned that Daniel's marketing firm was struggling financially and looking for an investor to help them expand. Through a series of intermediaries, I arranged to become that investor, purchasing a controlling interest in the company. Daniel had no idea that his mother now owned the business that employed him. I attended exactly one board meeting, sitting in the back wearing a hat and sunglasses, listening as the company's management discussed their plans for restructuring. When they mentioned that some positions might need to be eliminated, I made sure Daniel's name was on the list. Not out of cruelty, but because I wanted him to experience the uncertainty and fear that I'd lived with for so many years. When Daniel was laid off, he called me again, this time sobbing into the phone. "I don't understand what's happening to me, Mom. Everything's falling apart. I'm going to lose everything." And that's when I decided it was time to reveal the truth. "Daniel," I said gently. I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. I explained everything, how I'd bought his debts, orchestrated his job loss, and restructured my estate to exclude him. You called me worthless baggage, son. I wanted to show you what it feels like to carry some real weight. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long, I thought he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. You did this to me? My own mother? I could hear the shock, the betrayal, the disbelief in his voice. I did, I confirmed. And I'm not finished yet. You have a choice to make, Daniel. You can continue down this path, or you can start learning what it means to value the people who love you. I explained that I was willing to forgive his debts and help him get back on his feet, but only if he could prove that he'd truly changed. What do you want from me? He asked, and I could hear him crying. I want you to come home, I said. I want you to spend 1 month living in my apartment, working at the diner where I've spent years of my life, and learning what it means to struggle. I want you to understand what my life has been like while you've been playing the part of a successful businessman. If you can do that, if you can show me that you remember who you are and where you came from, then we can talk about forgiveness. Daniel was quiet for a long time before answering. And if I refuse? Then you'll carry this debt for the rest of your life, and you'll do it without a mother to help you bear the weight. 3 days later, Daniel showed up at my apartment door with a single suitcase, looking like a broken man. Victoria hadn't come with him. Apparently, learning about his true financial situation and his mother's role in it had been the final straw for their marriage. He moved into my tiny living room, sleeping on the fold-out couch where I'd spent so many nights working on laundry and sewing to support him years earlier. The first week was hell for both of us. Daniel was sullen and resentful, going through the motions of working at the diner but treating customers and co-workers with barely concealed contempt. I watched him struggle to take orders from people he considered beneath him, saw him wince when his expensive shoes got dirty from mopping floors. But gradually something began to change. Maybe it was talking to Rosa, one of the other waitresses, who told him about working 3 jobs to put her daughter through nursing school. Maybe it was serving coffee to Mr. Thompson, an elderly regular who'd lost his pension when his company went bankrupt. Or maybe it was just the sheer exhaustion of physical labor that began to humble him. By the end of the 2nd week, Daniel started asking questions. He wanted to know about the customers' lives, their struggles, their dreams. He began to see them as real people rather than just faces to serve. And slowly, he started asking me questions too, about those years when he was young, about the sacrifices Robert and I had made, about why I'd chosen to continue working at the diner even when I didn't have to. I never understood, he said one evening as we sat in my tiny kitchen, eating leftover soup from the diner. I thought you were just settling. I thought you were afraid to want more. He looked around the modest apartment, really seeing it for the first time. But this isn't about fear, is it? This is about knowing what's important. We talked that night like we hadn't talked in years. Daniel told me about the pressure he'd felt to succeed, how he'd gotten caught up in trying to impress people who didn't really care about him. He admitted that his marriage to Victoria had been as much about status as love, and that losing her had been both devastating and liberating. I became someone I don't like, he said, tears streaming down his face. I became someone who could call his own mother worthless baggage and think it was funny. How did I turn into that person? We all make choices, honey, I told him. The question is what you're going to choose now. By the end of the month, Daniel had become a different person. Not the scared little boy he'd been when his father left, and not the arrogant man he'd become in Chicago, but someone in between. Someone who understood both struggle and success. Someone who valued relationships over appearances. On his last day at the diner, the other employees threw him a small goodbye party. Rosa hugged him tight and made him promise to stay in touch. Mr. Thompson shook his hand and told him he'd been proud to watch him grow during his time there. Daniel cried. Understanding for the first time in years what it meant to be valued for who you are rather than what you have. That night I gave him the paperwork, showing that all his debts had been forgiven. I also gave him a check, not enough to return to his old lifestyle, but enough to start over somewhere new, to build something real instead of something flashy. "I'm not giving you back your inheritance," I explained. "That money is going to help people who need it, people like single mothers trying to raise their children alone. But I'm giving you something more valuable, a second chance to be the man I raised you to be." Daniel stayed in town for another week, spending time with me, helping me around the apartment and just talking. We laughed together for the first time in years, sharing memories of his childhood and Robert's kindness. When he finally left, heading to a smaller city where he'd found a job with a non-profit organization, I knew I had my son back. That was 5 years ago. Daniel calls me every week now and visits every few months. He remarried last year, a lovely woman named Sarah, who works as a social worker and shares his new understanding of what's truly important in life. Their wedding was small and simple, held in the backyard of the little house they bought together. And when Daniel made his speech that day, he talked about the lessons his mother had taught him, about love, sacrifice, and the difference between having worth and carrying worthless weight. I'm 78 now, and my health isn't what it used to be, but I'm not worried about my legacy anymore. My son knows who he is and where he came from. He understands that success isn't measured by what you have, but by who you lift up along the way. And when my time comes, I know he'll carry forward the real values that Robert and I tried to teach him. Not the material wealth I could have left him, but the understanding that every person has worth, especially the ones who love you enough to sacrifice everything for your happiness. You know, people sometimes ask me if I regret what I did, if I think I was too harsh in teaching Daniel that lesson. But I look at the man he became, at the way he treats people now, at the work he's doing to help families in crisis, and I know I made the right choice. Sometimes love means letting someone fall, so they can learn to stand on their own. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give your child isn't what they want, but what they need to become the person they were meant to be. And sometimes when someone calls you worthless baggage, the best response is to show them what real weight looks like. Not the weight of resentment or bitterness, but the weight of consequences, of truth, of love that's strong enough to demand better. That's my story, honey. It's not a pretty tale, but it's a true one. And if you're dealing with someone in your life who takes you for granted, who sees your love as weakness and your sacrifices as worthless, I want you to know that you have more power than you think. You have the power to demand respect, to set boundaries, and to teach the people you love that your worth isn't determined by their appreciation. It exists whether they recognize it or not. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's selfishness. Sometimes the greatest kindness is teaching someone a hard lesson. And sometimes the heaviest baggage isn't what you carry, but what you're willing to put down. I hope my story helps you remember your own worth. I hope it reminds you that love doesn't mean accepting disrespect, and that being a good parent, partner, or friend sometimes means being willing to let people face the consequences of their choices. Because at the end of the day, the only way people learn to value what they have is by understanding what it means to lose it. Thank you for listening to my story, sweetheart. It means more than you know to have someone who understands, who sees the love behind the difficult choices. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own worth or helped you see a situation in your life differently, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me about a time when you had to make a hard choice out of love, or share your thoughts about standing up for yourself when others take you for granted. Your stories, your wisdom, your support, they create a community of people who understand that real strength sometimes looks like letting go, and that the most powerful love is the kind that demands growth. By sharing your experiences, you're helping others who might be facing similar struggles, showing them they're not alone in their journey toward self-worth and healthy relationships. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because everyone has a story worth telling, and together we can remind each other that our worth isn't determined by how others treat us, but by how we choose to value ourselves. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these powerful real-life stories that prove love, resilience, and self-respect can overcome even the deepest betrayals. Until next time, remember, you are never worthless baggage. You are precious cargo, deserving of respect, love, and appreciation. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise.